Well, Amy and Jolene are here, and they're going to talk to us a bit about some changes moving forward and what they found in this most recent year's data. Welcome. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us. We look forward to talking with you today. We're going to start the day by presenting some of the findings from the data that you submitted for fiscal year 2014. We'll walk through some of the results. This is really just some preliminary results. We have intentions to do some additional analyses after the meeting today, but this is sort of where we are at this point. I wanted to thank you all for submitting your data on time. Everyone got their data in before the end of the year. That was great. And I also want to thank you for being so responsive to Jolene's requests. How many of you have gotten emails from Jolene asking questions for clarification? Yes, she's been working very hard. So we really appreciate everyone has been really responsive and very cooperative about that. And we'd like to structure our presentation today as really more an interactive forum. We don't want to lecture to you. Please feel free to interrupt us if you have questions, either about the data we're presenting or about any of the changes we're talking about making with the data collection forms. We really want to get your feedback. That's really important to making this all work. And we're going to start, as I said, by presenting some of the findings from the data that you all submitted last year. And Jolene's going to start that off. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Is there anyone who cannot hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, so just as Amy has shared with you and mentioned, we will first discuss what we found in the 2013-2014 data set. And again, thank you for responding to my multiple emails. It actually has really helped us prepare for this meeting to give some story of what we know so far from the 2013-2014 data. So basically what we'll share with you this morning is first let you know how we looked at the data. We looked at it as time 1 data and time 2. So the data that you collected at intake, we'll share with you what we see there. And then also the data you shared with us at the time of discharge or at what you defined as time 2. So specifically, we'll talk about in time 1 and time 2, who are we collecting data on? Who are these caregivers or biological mothers? And also the indexed children. And then we'll talk about, given what we know so far, what are the next steps and how we want to look at the data and how we want to proceed in collecting data for 2014-2015. First, a footnote. There are 20 agencies, as you know, that are participating. However, for the 2013-2014 data analysis, we were able to get data from 18 of the agencies. 2 were unable to obtain IRB approval in time. So that's just a footnote to keep in mind as we share the preliminary findings. Oh, and also another footnote. Since these are preliminary findings, I will still be emailing you for some clarification on the data. And again, I really appreciate your time. And what we're hoping is that as we proceed with these revised data collection forms, you won't be hearing from me as much about what your data means or what the data is. Okay? So time 1. How did we determine who is in the time 1 sample? First of all, we wanted to look at data that you provided for cases that had intake dates within the fiscal year. So that meant we did drop some cases that had had intake dates outside the fiscal year, meaning if there's any intake dates that were before September 30th, 2013, or intake dates after September 29, 2014. Okay, so that dropped out several cases. Let's see here. So for the caregivers, that was about 158 cases were dropped from the time 1 analysis, and there were actually 4 cases that had intake dates after the fiscal year ended. We also had data from some of the agencies, some of the programs that did note if there were caregivers that were not biological mothers. What we did find is that a majority of the caregivers that we have data for are biological mothers. So we focus on those cases. But just to let you know, we did receive data that had caregivers that were either biological fathers, step-parents, grandparents, and other types of caregivers. So we do have that data as well. Let's see. We also recognize that caregivers have more than one indexed child that's served by your programs. But for the purposes of looking at the caregiver data, we made sure that in our data set, there were caregivers that were not counted more than once because they had more than one indexed child. So just to clarify how we analyze the cases. However, when we looked at the indexed children, we did not need to take into account whether the caregiver is a biological mom or not. Okay? So any questions about who was in our Time 1 data analysis?
I'll just also note that we had some cases where a biological mother had more than one intake during the fiscal year. And in those cases, we looked at the first intake record for her.
All right, so who are the biological mothers that we looked at? Let's look at some demographic information. Oh, how many, are you wondering how many biological moms we were looking at? The sample size, 342. So as you can see in the second bullet point, we focus on 342 biological mothers. So these 342 biological mothers, about a third of them are single, never married, or two-thirds. We also found that almost 50%, that is specifically 46%, are Caucasian. At least a quarter, that is 29%, were African American. And we did find that almost a quarter, that is 21%, are multiracial background of our biological mothers. I'm sorry, 8%. 8% are multiracial. That's okay. As far as Hispanic background, 21% are Hispanic background. And as the ages of our mothers that we looked at, about 26% or 26% are under 25 years old. And what we found about those that are under 25 years old, 5% of them are teenage moms. That is, they're 19 years old or younger. And then 21% are 35 years or older, and then at least half, 51%, are in the 25 to 35 year range. So about half of the moms are mid-20s to mid-30s. Okay. 91% are native English speakers. And, oh, I'm sorry, question?
Yeah, in terms of the racial and ethnicity, so you had about 17% that were represented there. Were those just multiple other races, or?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, if you should have the data tables in your packet, and that has the full breakdown of the frequencies. What we're presenting here is just sort of a selected categories, just so we could fit everything on the slides. But you should have the complete frequency distributions.
Yeah, so we're presenting here the highlighted preliminary findings, but in your handouts is the data tables, all the data tables that we've produced from our analyses. Okay. So whatever is not presented here is definitely in the data tables handout. So where are these, what is the living situation of the mothers that we looked at? So the housing and household composition, over 50%, that is 61%, live in a house or apartment. However, we don't know if they own or rent. What we do know is that 61% do live in a house or apartment. There are 10% that do not have a house or apartment that are homeless. And 9% that live in residential treatment facility. We also, as you know, gather data on who is living in the household. And what we found is at least a quarter, 28%, are the caregiver is the only adult, the only grown-up in the household. And 22% live with the index child's father or partner, and there are 20% that live with other grown-ups. I should also note that for the household composition, that the caregiver can check off, can live with both index child's father as well as with other grown-ups, other relatives. Yes?
For families that are living in assisted living or transition housing, are they under live-in house or apartment or homeless?
Okay, so the question is for those that are living in assisted living? Is that right? Let's see, if you turn, in your handout, if you turn to page 4, I will note that not all the possible responses are in this slide, but if you go to page 4, tables, let's see, 9 and 10, let's see here. Table 9, housing arrangements. This lists all the possible response options for this question. So supported living arrangements, we have here listed at 6%. Okay. Any other questions about this item? Yes.
I just have a question about when a woman lives with her family, that's not considered homeless. Is it considered homeless if she's living with family but she's staying in the living room?
Okay, so if she's staying in the living room.
I'm filling out the documents if that's the case.
Okay, so that's a really good question, and I don't think it was very clear on this data collection form. So one of the changes we're actually planning to make, as we'll talk about later, is we're adding some questions about that kind of situation where people are living doubled up. So you'll be able to actually indicate that on the next, in the future.
Yes.
Will we be going through each of the questions later on today? Or
Yes.
more
For the
like
revised?
How you were looking for it to all be defined?
Yes, so towards the end, we will be going through the revised data collection form. And as Amy mentioned earlier, we are definitely interested in any thoughts or feedback that you have at this time, because we want to make sure that this data collection form collects information efficiently and it collects useful information for you. Yes, Ricky?
Jolene, under household composition or maybe elsewhere, do you list the total number of children in the household, not just the indexed child, but just total number of children?
Yeah, in the 2013-2014 data collection form, there are items that ask what is the total number of other children and total number of non-indexed children. So we have, it is in the data tables in this handout. Yes?
But in the form, those are children of the parent, not in the household.
Right. That is correct. That's a very good, thank you. The number of children that are collected is the number of children of the caregiver, not the number of children that are living in the household. So if there is another adult that has children in the household, those children are not counted in our tally for the 2013-2014 data collection. Okay. All right, so moving on. We also gathered information about what is the household income, so not just the caregiver's income, but the household income. And what we found is that over half, that is 64%, do have cash income. Of those that have cash income, we collected information on what is the common sources of their cash income. And what we found is that at least a quarter, that is 26%, do receive cash income through employment. There's also the second highest is TANF at 24%. And there are families or households that have income from spouse, family, friends, SSI, and SSDI. Okay. And again, when you look in your data table handout, it lists all the possible sources of income. What you see here right now are just the ones that have the highest percent reported sources. Okay. In addition to cash income, we also looked at non-cash income. About at least 3/4, that is 75% of caregivers that we looked at did receive non-cash income. The sources of the non-cash income primarily are from Medicaid, but at 89% of caregivers receiving Medicaid income, followed by food stamps and SNAP at 81% of caregivers receiving non-cash income through that source. We also have families that are receiving WIC. That is 46% of the households are receiving WIC, and 21% are receiving housing non-cash income. So in addition to demographic information of the families that we looked at, or caregivers, I should say, we also looked at, you collected information on what are the risk factors of the mothers that you're serving, the families you serve. What we find is that the highest is 75% do have a history of substance abuse, which you all know makes sense since a majority of agencies primarily focus on substance use. What we also find is that almost half of the caregivers that we have data on were a victim of adult domestic violence. And from what I saw from the agenda yesterday, some, if not all of, or most of you participated in skills building, which focused on trauma-informed services. So it seems like this is definitely a good fit as to what the caregivers are experiencing. In addition to domestic violence, there's history of psychiatric illness among 45%. However, we don't have information on what is the mental health diagnosis or if there is a formal diagnosis. But we do know that at least, or 45% do have a history of psychiatric illness. There is 43% that were convicted of crime. There are 37% that had a child removed from home due to abuse, neglect. And again, we do have some trauma history. There's at least 30% that were physically abused as a child or sexually abused. We also have families, 21% that have sold drugs. And then again, as expected, there are caregivers that were diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, since about 6 agencies focus on HIV AIDS services. So 20% are diagnosed with HIV AIDS, followed by 14% have ever been engaged in prostitution. Okay. Sure.
One of the things I noted to Jolene when she was showing me the results of the analysis she was running was sort of the link between some of these risk factors. So for example, we know that many of these mothers have a history of substance abuse, which may explain, for example, the high rates of mothers who had a history of selling drugs or who had engaged in prostitution. Both of those behaviors are often used by people with substance abuse histories in order to pay for their drugs. So I think there's a link across some of these risk factors.
So do any of these percentages surprise you? I think these are things that hopefully just confirm what you already know in the and what you already do in your programs. Yes?
Question, have you thought about looking at history of incarceration as a maternal risk factor also?
Is that still in the...
I think...
I didn't see it on your printout, so I just wondered if you thought about adding that in.
That's good. That would be a great idea. Thank you.
There was a question about if we are collecting data on history of incarceration. We will include that in the new revised form if it isn't there. Vaguely. Okay. So yes.
Is the child removal current or at any or historic? In other words, at any time, or is that at the time of intake?
It's historic at time of intake. So you also collected information on what substances were used while the biological mom is pregnant. And 42% did use substances while pregnant. Of those that were using substances, those that were most commonly used is tobacco at 47%, marijuana 40%, and also alcohol, amphetamines, which includes amphetamines, and crack and cocaine were the most commonly used while the biological mom was pregnant. Given this information, what do we know about these biological mothers receiving treatment prior intake? What we do know is that 60% did receive treatment for alcohol or drug use. And of those that received treatment prior to intake, the type of treatments that they used, 47% used outpatient, followed by residential at 40%. And there were also caregivers that used self-help, detoxification, hospital-based. We noted that for residential hospital-based, we weren't clear on what the distinction is. So as you might have seen in the new revised forms, we have outpatient as one type of treatment, and then residential / inpatient as another type.
I also note that about 50% of the mothers that had received some type of treatment had actually received more than one type. So that's why the percentages total much more than 100%.
So that's what we know primarily about the mothers. How about the indexed children? Well, when we look at their age, we see that about a third are less than a year old, a third are infants, And then either above or just below 10% are preschoolers or toddlers, so ranging from 1 to 6 years of age. It ranges around about 10% are between toddlers and preschool age. And then when we look at children that are in elementary school or preteens, that's between 7 and 12 years old, they are at a much smaller number in our sample size. So 5% are 7 to 9 years old, and 3% are 10 to 12 years old. Okay.
I was actually kind of surprised the mean age of the children was just over 4 years old. So, even though the programs tend to focus on younger children, because there were some of these older children in the sample, the mean was actually about 4 years old.
And we already know that at least 2 agencies also work with teenagers. So we have 6% of the index children that we looked at are between 13 and 18 years of age. Okay. And we do have some missing data, but this is the distribution of ages that we found among the index children that are served by your programs. Any questions about that? Okay, we also looked at at-risk characteristics at birth. So what we found is that 21% of the index children were born at 36 weeks or less, so they were preterm babies. There were also babies that weighed between 2 to 5 pounds, so very low birth weight, that's 18% of the children. About a quarter required special care needs, which includes needing a heart monitor or feeding tubes. 11% had congenital abnormalities. And then again, since some agencies do focus on HIV/AIDS services, there are 11% that were exposed to HIV. And as you know, you also collected data on how long the children stayed in the hospital. So what we found is that 26% stayed in the hospital for more than 3 days, and 14% stayed in the hospital longer than medically necessary. What we found is that 70% of those that stayed in the hospital for non-medical reasons did not provide reasons why. So there's a large percent that did stay in the hospital for non-medical reasons, but we don't have information of what the reasons may be. Toxicology screening at birth. Half of the children, or 55%, were screened for toxicology screening. Of those that were screened, 35% were tested positive for any substance. Now, we also were able to find out what substances they were tested positive for, but I want to say that there were at least almost half, 43%, of these children that were tested positive had missing data on what they were tested positive for. So for those that we have data on, we found that marijuana was the most common substance that the babies were tested positive for. 19% were tested positive for marijuana, followed by crack cocaine at 15%, and then opiates and methadone at 9% each. Okay. So where are our index children living at the time of intake? What we find is that about half of them are living at home. Specifically, 34% are living at home with no child welfare services involvement, while the other part, that's 21%, are living at home but with child welfare services involvement. Okay? And about almost a quarter do live in foster care. So 13% live in foster care home, or 11% live in formal kinship foster care. And then we also have information that 7% live with family, 5% live in residential treatment with a biological parent, and 8% live in other living arrangements. Yes?
If I'm understanding it, I think the concern is that it looks as if we have toxicology information on every birth of every index child, but some of these index children you reported were significantly older. Right. So
that's why there's so much missing data. Yes, and that's why there's so much missing data. So we have data. The total number of children in our data file is 354, but of those 354, not all of them have data on toxicology screening.
how many are missing?
Yeah, if you look at the tables in the data table handout, you'll see that we're missing data for 22% of the children.
But you have 194 who do have answers, whether or not they were screened.
Of those that were screened.
And what's not showing in this table are the ones who definitively were not screened.
No, the 194 is those who were screened.
That's what I'm saying, but there's a good number who were not screened.
Right.
So your N here is 194. And which is, I guess, maybe 194 is approximately half of your total number.
I think that N is 354, and half of them have been screened. So
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
the 194.
That's the 194.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay, is that clear? Let me try to walk you through that again. So of the 354 total cases that we have, only 55% we have data that they were screened, okay? Now, of those 55% that were screened, 194 of them have data that they were tested positive, okay? So we're looking at sample size of 190.
No, that's not right.
Oh, okay. Here, let me.
No. 194 were screened. Of those, 35% tested positive.
Okay, yes. Okay, so 194 were, of those 194 that were tested positive, that were tested, of those that were tested, that is 194 that were tested, 68 of them, we have data that they were tested positive. So basically, the sample size gets smaller and smaller of what we have data on for toxicology screening. In other words, we don't have data on a lot of the cases, the index children cases that we have on toxicology screening. Yes?
I'm wondering, do we have more than one index child per biological mother?
Yes, we do. So the question was, do we have more than one index child for a biological mother? And the answer is yes.
I thought they said they took
But you left those out of the analysis.
No.
No. In the index child analysis, we included all the children. So whether there are children that had the same caregiver, we still included them. In the caregiver data set, we only counted the mother once if they had more than one index child. Okay, so that's the time one sample, the information that we have on caregivers and index children. Now Amy will share with you what we found in the time two sample.
Okay, so defining the time two sample was a little more complicated, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So some of the programs, well actually the vast majority of programs, they define time two as when either the biological mother or the index child was discharged from the program. There were a small number of programs, however, that also provided data for biological mothers and index children who were actually still receiving services from the program. We have some information about those biological mothers and those index children in the data tables, but for today we're going to focus on the biological mothers and the index children who had ended services. And the reason for that is that those who are still receiving services will eventually show up in the exited services group. So we will actually have data for them at exit at a later point. So we're going to be talking now about time two data at exit for 238 biological mothers and 211 index children. And then we're going to focus on the 147 biological mothers and 141 index children who had exited at time two. So The difference between 147 and 238 are those who were still in the program, and the same with the difference between 211 and 141. Those other index children are also still receiving services. Yes.
These time two data are not necessarily related to the same people that we had the time one data.
That is correct. They're not a perfect overlap. The vast majority do overlap, but there are some children and mothers in the time two sample who may have entered the program prior to this fiscal year. So they are not in the time one data, right? Okay. So in terms of exit reasons, as you can see, 38% of these mothers exited the program because they had completed the program requirements. The remaining mothers had exited for reasons other than completing. And these reasons range from choosing to voluntarily terminate services, their whereabouts were unknown to the program, they were terminated for not complying with the program's requirements, they may have been transferred to another agency or moved out of the service area. So a variety of other reasons, but they did not complete services. In terms of their demographic characteristics, they look very similar to the time one data. 2/3 are single, never married, over half are white, another 30% are African American, and 23% are Latina. Again, English is the primary language for the vast majority of these mothers. In terms of their education, a little over 1/3 had no high school diploma or GED, about 1/3 had a high school diploma or GED, and about 20% had at least some college. And one thing I'll note about that last category, at least some college, very few of the mothers actually had a college degree. The vast majority just had some college. I think 4 or 5% maybe had actually completed a 2 or 4 year degree. In terms of their receipt of alcohol or other drug treatment since intake, so this is while they were in the program, almost 70% had gotten some type of treatment. And then you can see that the various types of treatment they received, the most common being outpatient treatment, 61%, a little over half got some kind of self-help, and 43% were in some type of residential treatment.
These are not mutually exclusive here, even though it says most recently, and you would assume that meant their last.
Right. Some agencies checked off multiple categories, even though the question specifically asked about most recent. Some checked more than one, and we had no way of knowing which was actually the most recent. They were probably just checking everything they got since intake. Good point. Yes.
Or just by having the self-help category in there, you could have a 12-step program while you were in inpatient or while you were in outpatient.
Right. That's true. Although if you add outpatient and residential together, that's also over 100%. And you can't be outpatient and residential at the same time. That wouldn't work. Okay, so in addition to looking at the drug and alcohol treatment, we also had some data about other types of services that the biological mothers received. By far the most common were case management, and these are services provided by the AIA program itself, by your programs, not by other service providers. So 80% got case management, 78% parenting classes, 61% got assistance with transportation, 57% got recovery support, and 55% got peer counseling. I won't read through the entire list, but these are the services that your programs provided. We also then looked at the most common types of services the mothers received, regardless of who provided them. So these could be services that your programs provided, or services provided by partner agencies with whom you work. Again, the most common type of service was case management and parenting classes, but then you can see the list start to diverge a little bit, and this reflects the fact that some of these other agencies are providing services that your programs are not necessarily providing. So for example, primary care, that wasn't something that a lot of your programs provided, but it was something that a lot of partner agencies were providing.
So all reported by program staff.
Yes.
So it may be, in some cases, sort of an undercount of actual.
Right, you might not necessarily know that a client was getting something from another agency if they didn't report that to you. This is only what the agency knew about. That's correct. Okay, the index children. Their exit reasons look similar to the exit reasons for the biological mothers. That's because in many cases they exited at the same time for the same reason, but they're not exactly the same. So there are some cases where a child may have exited either before or after the biological mother. So the differences aren't, they don't precisely overlap. And again, you can see 39% of the children, the most likely the biological mother had completed the program requirements. And then again, you can see the other common reasons: terminating services voluntarily, losing contact, being transferred to another agency. Yes?
If you wanted to look at predictors of success in the program, how would you measure success in the program?
That's a good question. Maybe other people have some thoughts about this. I mean, different programs, don't forget, have different goals. So it would be a little bit program dependent. I mean, there's probably some goals that you share in, things like better child well-being, so that we could probably come up with some common goals. But again, there are probably some that are very program specific, depending on the specific population that you're serving.
To take, and frequently this is what you have, if you wanted to take this discharge status and determine, from that whether or not they successfully completed the program. Is it just the 39%, or would some consider other sort of discharge reasons, like adopted for the children, as a success?
I think that's open for discussion, how you want to define success. I don't know that there's a right answer to that question. And it's certainly, with respect to looking at predictors, I mean, that's certainly something you could do, looking at the characteristics of the mothers and the children at time 1 and seeing how that relates to their outcome at time 2. But specifically how you define a successful exit, again, that's really open for discussion, whether or not you want to just define it as program completion, or whether you want to include some of these other possible outcomes, like a child achieving permanency through adoption or guardianship. I mean, that could also be considered a successful outcome.
Yeah, but in this case, you wouldn't do that because it's less than 1%. So.
Yeah. Child welfare services involvement. 15% of the children had a report made to Child Protective Services since intake. And then there was also some information that were collected about the child welfare status of the children. And this is of all the children, not just those that had a report made since intake. So this would include children that may have had some involvement prior to intake. So 41% of the children had some sort of active child welfare services involvement at the time of exit from the program. 38% had no involvement, no history of involvement at all. 17% had some involvement, but the case was closed. And then 4% we were just missing data for, we didn't know. So a very large share of these children, so if you add the 41% and the 17% together, well over half of these children, approaching 60% of the children, have had some type of child welfare involvement, either current or prior. Yes?
I don't remember, but on the form, does it say no child welfare involvement at all, or does it say at time 2? Because I think I filled that out at time 2, there's no longer.
Well, then you would have checked case closed, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right, so if they had involvement, but the involvement was they were no longer involved, you would have checked case closed, I would imagine. So that's why I'm assuming that no involvement means no involvement. I could be wrong, but that's how the categories look to us, was that because there was a case closed category, it seemed like no involvement just meant no involvement. But correct, I mean, you're the ones that filled out the form, so you would know. Okay, and again, for the children, we looked at types of services provided. First, we looked at only those services provided by the program itself, by the AIA program. Again, case management being the most common. A little over a third of the children had some kind of development or education services. 29% had HIV screening. A little over a quarter had some type of developmental screening or assessment. And then the next most common, 20% had legal advocacy, and another 20% had some kind of nutrition services. And these were the services that the AIA programs provided. And then we looked at all services, including those provided by other agencies. Again, you see some other things popping up here. So, for example, pediatric care suddenly appears as a very common service, which you would expect. And it might not be something that an AIA program would provide itself. It might be something you refer a child to. Similarly with daycare services, not necessarily something your program provides, but something many of the children probably needed. Okay, so next steps. Where are we going from here? I've seen some frequency distributions, just very simple, basic statistics. In terms of additional analyses, we have sort of two tracks that we're thinking about pursuing at the moment. One is to do some comparisons between the mothers and children being served by the programs that primarily focus on substance use. So that's 12 of these programs, 14 total, but the two programs that didn't provide data are also substance abuse agencies. And then comparing those mothers and children to the mothers and children being served by the programs that primarily focus on HIV/AIDS, and to look and see how both the differences in the characteristics of the mothers and children being served, but also looking at differences in the types of services that are being provided. So that's sort of one track that we're thinking of pursuing for next steps. Oh, I'm sorry, yes?
How would you account for the programs that do both HIV and AIDS service provision and substance abuse treatment?
So Amanda, I'm gonna let you take this question since this was a question I asked you. So she wanted to know about programs that serve both, that focus both on substance use and HIV.
And how you do that analysis.
Right, and that was the question I had for you.
Sure. So my understanding is that we have about 6 programs who are specifically HIV programs. We have another 2 to 4 who are predominantly substance use programs, but may see some folks with HIV. So the way we had this group, the 6 who are predominantly HIV, who obviously there's some overlap and they see families affected by substance use and that's part of their service provision, is grouped here. The folks who are predominantly substance use who happen to see a few clients with HIV are not included here. Does that make sense?
And then the other sort of track of additional analyses we're thinking about pursuing are looking at differences between the mothers and index children who exited the program because of completion, that group of 38 or 39%, versus those who exited for various other reasons, either voluntarily leaving or being discharged from the program by the program itself, just to compare those groups to see either if they differ in terms of the characteristics of those mothers and children, or if they differ in terms of the types of services that they receive from the program. So those are the two sort of tracks we're right now contemplating pursuing. Of course, we're open to other ideas. People have thoughts about other types of analyses they would like to see us do. We're certainly open to talking about those. So people have thoughts about other ways of cutting and slicing the data that you might want to suggest? No ideas?
I want to think about looking at length of engagement in the program, because completion is variable and folks get a benefit if there's a certain length of time engaged in services. So it might be a third cut, so you might get, it might shed some additional outcomes by looking at that group of folks who are non-completers but had certain benchmarks in terms of length of involvement.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It gets a little bit tricky because some of the programs, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of your programs have a very specific length of time. I believe, for example, one program is like 16 weeks and that's it. That's it. Whereas other programs are more open-ended, where you could continue to receive services for a year, 2 years, and so it gets a little bit tricky when you're trying to make to sort of break that down by length of time, because you're going to have some mothers and children are going to have no longer than 16 weeks, even if they completed the program, whereas others who didn't complete the program could be receiving services for a year. So we'll have to think about how to do that, but I think it is a good idea to look at something about how the length of time in the program is related either to the characteristics of the mothers and children or to the types of services they're getting. I think that's a really good idea. Other thoughts? Yes.
Well, I asked you this question for exactly this reason, and because I've dealt with analyses like this, looking at different reasons, and often staff pick different reasons for it. So completed the program is generally, there's some, met treatment goals to some effect, degree, so that's a clear-cut positive. Then those that chose to terminate services, sometimes it's because they weren't a parent with a severe problem to start with, and they really didn't need additional services, so they take themselves out for probably good reasons. But other times they choose to terminate because they don't want to really do it. And that one is almost impossible to tell which direction they're going in. Those who you're unable to contact, that's clear cut, you have not been able to engage them or keep them retained in the program.
Although you could argue that some of those, maybe you can't contact them because they don't really need the service and they floated away. So it's not, I don't know how you interpret lost contact either.
Well, and that is something that, is dependent upon the program. Certainly termination for non-compliance is fairly clear-cut.
Although, again, I guess you could make the case that losing contact, if one of the things you're supposed to do as part of being in the program is keep the program apprised of your location, maybe some of those who were classified as can't locate should be included in non-compliance.
You should get some people, I think it's almost open to question how some of these categories were used. Right. And when you compare just completed treatment with all these other categories, including deceased and moved, they may want to take them out because those are sort of external causes, and they're just muddying the waters for your analysis.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tricky to what to do with all that whole other group of who didn't complete. We know they didn't complete the program, but exactly why they left is a little muddy.
So you may want to just get some additional information from programs about sort of what they actually meant for the program, some of these other categories, just to be clearer in your own mind, whatever results you have.
Other thoughts people have? Yes.
I would think it would be helpful to have a wider range of outcomes for this client population, both adults and children. If you could measure client functioning before, during, and after participation in the program, I think your analysis would be much more powerful, much more influential.
Can you give an example of what you mean by functioning?
Criminal thinking, physical health, emotional health,
Parenting attitudes.
The recovery environment in which they're living, employment, educational activities. Some of those kinds of outcomes would be, I think,
But they have to be in a common data set.
they'd have to be in a common data.
Yeah, so one of the things you may remember that we had sent out back early winter, I think it was, sort of a form for the local evaluators to fill out, asking them to indicate all of the standardized instruments that they were using to collect data, either on the mothers, the children, the family, the home environment. And we found that there was only 3 or 4 instruments that were being used across even 8 or 9 of your programs. The vast majority of instruments people were using, they were either the only ones using it or only one other program was using it. It was just really hard to find instruments that there was even a critical mass of programs using. So that's actually something to think about moving forward, is whether or not programs can come to some agreement, consensus on what instruments to use so that there is some more commonality with the measures that we have to work with. Because right now, there just really isn't much of anything in terms of standardized measures that are being used across the programs.
On the services data, it might be useful to contemplate quantifying the services. You certainly have a wide array of different services, so the nature of the services look good. But I find it very helpful to be able to determine a service is provided and how many sessions, how much time.
So dosage.
Exactly.
Dosage measures.
Right. Quite right.
Those are great suggestions.
Well, I think right now, if you look at the data as it relates to time 1, it looks like all of our programs are doing a fairly good job, even at time 1, in terms of keeping children in safe environments, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of being able to demonstrate the efficacy of our interventions, there's not much there's less room for improvement. And I know that those questions are difficult to answer because clearly we wouldn't tolerate anybody in this unsafe situation. But I think that's the challenge we need to look at.
Yes. Oh, sorry, there were 2 hands at your table.
I was just wondering if your team has considered the use of administrative data, data that comes directly from the child welfare system regarding placements, subsequent maltreatment.
Yeah, I'm actually a child welfare researcher, and a lot of the research I do involves using child welfare administrative data. And yes, we have talked about doing that. I know that was one of the questions we had for the local evaluators, was we asked about how many of them were currently collecting administrative data and what they were using those data for. And actually, quite a few of the programs are actually already doing that. The question is whether or not we can actually get permission to have those data, right? So the local evaluators have them. Whether or not we can also make arrangements for us to get those data is a different story. But that's something we can definitely think about doing. It gets a little tricky because different states have very different child welfare data. I mean, there are certain things that you could look at, some commonalities across states, but there are also some subtle differences about how things get defined, things like that still make combining data from different jurisdictions a little bit problematic, but there are ways of working around that. The other thing to note is that Chapin Hall houses the State Child Welfare Data Center, which is sort of a large multi-state archive of child welfare data from, I think now we're up to somewhere between 20 and 30 states. I don't remember the exact number. So we probably actually have some of those data in-house, and it would just be a matter of getting permission to use them and figuring out how we would be identifying the mothers and children in your programs, right? So we don't get any identifying information for these mothers and children. The data come to us from you all de-identified. So we don't have a way right now to link, for example, the data you're submitting to those administrative data that we may have. So we'd have to figure out how exactly to make that possible. I think you had a question, right?
Well, I was just going to say that as we move towards more integrated healthcare, we will begin to look at what defines successful completion and length of stay in treatment. I work in a 10-month day treatment facility, and so I've always thought all along that 10 months is good for everyone. One size fits all. And I think that as we begin to move forward, that's going to look different. That there may be a mom that comes in that's been using meth for 2 years that only needs 90 days of treatment, versus a mom who's been using meth for 10 years maybe needs 7 months of treatment, and so on and so on. And so how we define successful completion, I think, is going to really look different over the next year. And we'll hopefully, I'm thinking we need more successful completions. Like, I'm asking myself, why aren't people completing successfully? Is the treatment too long? Why are they exiting the program, and how do we define success, and where are our expectations? Are they too high?
Right.
So.
Other thoughts about analyses that people would like to see, or data they'd like to see collected? Yes.
Hi, it's Marnie Lanou. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, actually it's not a question about analyses, but when the request came out to send in the measures that we're collecting, which I did, I was hoping that information might come back out to the grantees so that we could sort of see what common measures might be, see what other programs are using. I know they talked about doing that 3 or 4 years ago.
We can certainly do that. We have all the data that the local evaluators provided. We could actually send out that spreadsheet that has indicates the number of programs that are collecting which measures.
And if people would be interested in that, I would be interested in that.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. We can do it next week. Yeah, that's no problem. People interested in that?
In what?
Okay. Yeah, we'll make sure we send that out to you next week. Yes. Yes, in the back, way back.
Yay! I'm really loud, so it's everyone will hear me. We were talking back here, and we thought it might be really interesting just to have a quick rundown of the number of biological mothers or index children each program is contributing, because we've noticed that some of the demographics you were going over differ from what we see coming into our program, and I think it's really interesting to know, are 50% of all of these people coming from 2 really big programs, and this is really more of a summary of those 2, or is it evenly split across everyone?
Yeah, we could actually produce those data pretty easily. We could do a crosstab of number of mothers and number of children by agency. We could certainly do that and send that out to you within the next week or so. Sure. Yes.
So from your review of what all the local evaluations are collecting, are there any common instruments?
Yeah, so just from memory, and I can, maybe when we take the break, I can confirm this, but the couple that I remember that stand out most to me are the API, the Adult and Adolescent Parent Inventory, okay. And then another one that I remember is the Parenting Stress Measure. I know that was used by quite a few programs. I think there's a third, but I can't remember. Do you remember what it is? Yeah, we'll take a look. I've got it on my laptop. I'll take a look and see what it is during break. But like I said, there was only 3, maybe 4 measures that even 8 or 9 programs were using. It was a pretty small list.
Well-being instruments in common, or
like the ASQ, or
yes, that was it. That was the one, ASQ. That was that. Thank you. That was the other one, the ASQ.
at least one measure in each of the, like addiction severity index, child well-being, parenting skills. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be.
Yeah, well, we'll send that list out to everyone either at the end of this week or early next week, so you can see how many programs and actually even which programs are using which measures, and then maybe somehow we can come to some type of consensus about these are measures that everyone should be using, or as many programs should be using as possible. Clearly, people would be free to use as many additional measures as they want. But if we could get a core of common measures, that would be great.
For your analysis, for your ability to find meaningful outcomes, that would.
No, exactly. You're exactly right. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So, just for planning purposes, can you give us an idea of the timeline in terms of when you think a decision will be made about which common instruments grantees are to use?
I think that's a discussion that Amanda and Ricky and I and Deb and Jolene and maybe Jan should be having. Maybe sometime after this meeting we can set up a call to talk about how that might work. And we'd certainly like get programs input as well, as far as there may be some measures that work for some programs and not for others, given the population you're serving. As Jolene pointed out, a few of the programs really focus on older kids, so some of the developmental measures may not make sense for them, or some of the measures, some of the programs that primarily focus on HIV/AIDS, some of the drug measures may not fit so well. So we'll just have to think about, there may have to be some flexibility there. Other questions?
I was just thinking of relating it to the training that we had yesterday, and she was talking about tracking the high-risk behaviors at admit, and then administering another questionnaire to see that those behaviors have declined. And so I think that, and looking at that, I think that's a huge measure of what we're talking about.
Exactly. Right.
No matter which program it is, I would think.
Right. Yes.
I think people who are the evaluators in the group, and where you have to go through IRBs, changing instruments.
It's not easy.
Means you have to go through an IRB process again, and it's midstream to do it, and also for the scales that you might use, some of them are very short. And those are possible to integrate into your current processes. But if they're long, the ASQ could involve, staff in different ways than they've been involved, to date. That's a different process. So you have to think carefully how doable it is.
Right, and you also have to think about the burden on the client, right? You don't want to be asking the client questions for 4 hours. So you kind of have to figure out what the priorities are. Because eventually they'll just start giving answers just to get through the measure, and that you won't have good data. Other thoughts people have? No? Okay. So at this point, we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about the data collection forms. And Jolene's going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of general changes that we're making, and then we can actually walk through some of the forms and you can see some of the more specific things.
Okay, with some of the programs that I've had frequent email exchanges with, I did share that we are in the works of revising the data collection forms. So here today with all of you, we can share with you what we have found that we wanted to revise and also get your feedback on. So we've made general changes and specific changes, as you may have seen in the updated forms that Amy has emailed to you. 3 general changes that we've made so far. One is the uniform identification number assignment. We wanted every program to use, you may already have heard this, but it hasn't been followed consistently, is that with the IDs that you assign with your cases, that there is a unique 4-digit family ID code. And then there would be the last two digits that are unique for the caregiver and index child. What's important here is that these ID numbers are used consistently throughout time 1 through time 2. Okay. What we found is that the ID numbers may have changed from time 1 to time 2, or for cases where a mother may have dropped out and re-entered, was given a different ID number. So for the purposes of our data analysis, it's very helpful that that ID number stays consistent throughout the whole course of involvement for the family, The second general change that we made is that instead of giving you a over 30-page data collection form, we're going to give you a data collection form for time 1 and a data collection form for time 2, and it would be separate for the caregiver and another one for the index child. We also do have a family form. So the bottom line here is that you will have a time 1 and a time 2 data collection form instead of just one big packet that you use throughout time 1, time 2 for child, mother, and family information. Okay, so that's the second general change. Third general change is that time 2. How are we defining time 2? When we looked through the 2013-2014 data set, we found that there were cases that were submitted when the mother or index child is still in the program at time 2. So moving forward with the 2014-2015 data set, time 2 is for those that have been discharged from the program, whether it's successful completion or for other reasons. Okay. So 3 general changes: uniform ID number assignment. You'll have specific forms for the second change, and the third one, time 2, is at the time of discharge. Okay. What are specific changes we made? So overall, 3 specific changes. We dropped items, added items, and rephrased items and responses. So what items did we drop with this new revised form? Well, we dropped items if they had a lot of missing data. So for example, one of the demographic items asked for nationality. We dropped that item because we already have, there was a lot of missing data for that item. And we already have information on their racial background and their ethnicity. So we found that the nationality item was not useful, so we dropped that. So that's an example of an item that missed data.
I'd say I think a even better example might be the income. There was a question that asked for the specific amount of cash income. I think it was the past month, and the amount of missing data there was, you can imagine, it was probably half of the cases that said they had some type of income were missing income. And my own experience is doing research in other projects is that information is often reported very unreliably, particularly when families may have earnings from employment that with the hours change from week to week, and they're just very unstable sources of income that just coming up with a number that's reliable is really difficult. So we decided that we were just going to drop the amount. We're just going to focus on the sources of the income.
Yeah, that's a great segue for another reason why we dropped items is the questionable reliability. Question in the back.
Yeah, I mean, is there something that still gathers immigration status?
Immigration status. We don't have an immigration status. Also, just we don't want to collect that because, from my experience, it is not frequently collected because of the repercussions. Plus, again, questionable reliability. Will we be able to get reliable information of their immigration status? So as far as the current, the items that we dealt with for 2013-2014, we did drop items because, again, for question reliability, like what Amy shared with you, the income question, how much exactly are you getting? Another example is the items that were just actually raised recently, the well-being, permanency, and safety. What we found is the scale for those items is very subjective. So asking how, to what degree is the child in a permanent environment? And as you may remember, the scale was a little so forth. Like it's very, very subjective. So we found that it would be more worthwhile to drop that and find other reliable measures for that. So those items were dropped. Duplicate items across the form. What we found is the placement question. Where's the child placed was asked both in the mother or the caregiver form as well as in the child form. And in the data, it was not always consistent what the answer was. So we only put that placement question in the child form because it's more relevant for the child. So there's another example for dropped items. Added items. As we mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier, some agencies provide information as to who the caregiver is. So we added in the 2014-2015 form, the caregiver's gender and relationship to the index child. And so, yeah, so hopefully we're getting a lot of good information for at least some of the agencies on that, such as their biological fathers that are also involved and so forth. Child welfare questions. Amy put some, I thought, some very helpful, more specific questions for child welfare. And actually, I'll explain that more as we go into the rephrase items and responses. Another set of items that we added that we thought would be very informative is that, as you might remember, in the Time 2 section, it asked for what are the services that were received. Well, in Time 1, we decided to add, well, what services are needed at intake? So then we have information as to what services are needed at intake and then what services were received by Time 2. Okay, so now we have a more complete picture on that. Yes? Oh.
Clear in that question whose assessment that is of what services are needed?
Yes, we'll have it for the caregiver, and then we have another set of for the child.
But I mean, in terms of whether the staff thinks these services are needed or the client group thinks these family services are needed?
That is a good question. Well, you know what, we're going to take a look into how we word that in the new form. So just to make sure that I understood you correctly, at Time 1, when we ask what services are needed, we'll phrase it as, what services does a program think this caregiver needs at Time 1?
Or so which would be, I guess the question is, which would be more useful? Would it be better to ask, what services does this parent think she needs? Or what services do you, as the professional service provider, think the parent needs? And I think the point you're raising is they could be very different answers. The question is, how should we rephrase that?
And think about who this is administered to, because right now staff fill it out about the case versus.
Right, that's
based on information that they've already.
Right, that's our understanding too, is that you're not necessarily sitting there with the client asking them each of these questions. It's more based on information you may have gathered through your own assessment. So that suggests to me that we would be asking, what do you as the service provider think this family needs? Does that make sense to people?
But then that also is reflective of what services are received. Those are going to be based on what the client saw as needed as services. So if you're comparing what services you think were needed and what services were received, and you're doing one from a staff perspective and clearly the other will be from the family perspective, then if you're trying to see whether or not the services that were identified were received, and you're doing one from the staff perspective and one from what the family is willing to do, then those don't match as well.
Or what was actually available at the time that the family was able to.
Yeah, right.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last.
I commented, and it also depends on what services are available. I mean, the worker filling out the form may say that this family needs X, Y, and Z, but those services turn out not to be available at a time that the family can make them, or for whatever reason. It's just difficult to capture all this.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Related question. Is that okay? Or are we still gonna?
So if we were to ask at Time 1, from the staff perspective, what services does the family need? Would the question be different at Time 2? Rather than asking what did they receive, would there be a different question we would want to ask?
I like the question.
Which question would that be?
The one at the beginning and one at the end. I think we should ask them what they need, because 9 out of 10 times they do know what they need. And they also know what they're willing to do. And so, and they also know what's available in the community, sometimes more than we do.
Okay, so just to recap, it sounds like what's most useful is to ask from the family's perspective what services they need at time 1. Is that correct? Yes.
I mean, it sounds like there's 2 different questions, and both
Yes,
are
there is.
valuable. So what if there was a question from the staff's perspective, you know, what treatment is recommended or what level of care is recommended, and at time 1, and also at time 2, a follow-up to that question as to whether or not the caregiver followed through with that recommendation, and perhaps some subcategories as to reasons why the client may not have. Whether it's around they disagreed with that recommendation or services were not available. And then, you know, the other question around what the caregiver, you know, felt was needed at time 1, and what they actually followed through with at time 2.
Okay. Okay. So at time 1, we will ask from the family's perspective what services are needed. And then at time 2, which services did the family follow through with? And if they didn't, for what reasons did they not?
Who are you asking? The staff that question?
Right now, just.
I think she's suggesting, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, the woman, Heidi, was suggesting that we actually have both measures, was that we have sort of the list of services and then indicate whether it's something that the staff identified as a need or the parent identified a need or perhaps both identified as a need.
Yeah, there are clearly going to be biases in both of them, and hopefully they pretty closely match, but, you know, for instance, if there's a mental health need, very often people are in denial that there's a problem there, but the staff person may identify that.
Yeah, actually, there's one of my colleagues at Chapin Hall did a paper a number of years ago looking at the assessment of service needs of families involved with the child welfare system. And they asked both the parents and the caseworkers what services this family need. And there was large discrepancies between the two. So I think that's a very good point.
The referrals made, I mean, at entry, the staff person might not really have a great sense of exactly what's needed, and through the treatment process, you know, they're going to see that the child needs a speech screening and, you know, developmental issues, whatever. And so, you know, the referral process is an important thing to track. I mean, that would help alleviate some of that initial, you know, not knowing the right need or who said what.
Right, exactly. So you may see at time 2 that the family received services that no one identified as a need back at time 1.
You know, these are the referrals that they got, and they followed up on these. Because sometimes that's also tied to their case plan for child welfare, that, you know, if you're not getting the services for your child that they clearly been identified to need, then, you know, we're not going to release you from your case.
Let's start here and then in the back. Yes.
Examining the congruence between what a client wants and a therapist thinks the client needs, and then comparing the actual provision of services with what was desired by the two parties could go a long ways towards explaining why people engage or don't engage.
Exactly.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Yes. So just to reiterate, at time 1, we will collect information on what the parent's perspective is on what services are needed, or the family's perspective, and then also get the perspective of the program's perspective on what services are needed. What we'll try to do is to make sure to have the form as brief as possible. So we'll try to format it that we are getting all this important information, but that it's not requiring too much thought or time in completing the forms. There was several questions in the back. Let me start with the gentleman here with dark shirt.
Talk about services. Are you meaning only the direct services that we provide, or all of the other ancillary support services?
We will be also just similar to the 2013-2014 form. There were separate questions. What services does the AIA program provide? What services are provided by non-AIA programs? We'll keep that format in the 2014-2015 form. And then please keep those in mind, what changes are needed or what's missing. And if we don't ask you at this time, please email us. But yes, keep in mind, if there's any services missing, let us know. Just very quickly, 2 more questions. The lady over here and then the gentleman in the back.
This is a more general question that I wanted to ask with this audience, which is, when I started working with the first AIA program, it was close to 10 years ago, and the guidance that we were given was sort of, if you're collecting these items already, then report them in the cross site. But now things are changing. Obviously, the nature of the items is changing, and everyone is getting on the same cycle. And I think the quality of the data, there's an attempt being made to increase the quality of the data and the usability of it. Is the expectation then that things that we're not currently collecting, we should start collecting, that we should be sort of populating as complete a data set as possible?
Yes. Yes. Also to help you and help you and your staff in your process of getting the data collected, because as you collect the data, you won't have to collect it later on and try to figure out, what is the data? So yes, to answer your question. The gentleman in the back.
So there sounded like there was a bit of a mismatch between perhaps what the family identifies as services needed and what the agency or the worker.
Yes.
I mean, isn't there an agreed upon plan, an agreed upon services that the family is going to receive, made with the worker and the family?
But you don't know what it takes.
I have an opinion on that, but someone.
At intake, you're going to identify the person.
Right? I mean, what did they agree upon?
The problem is that intake, they haven't agreed upon anything. They're brand new to the program, and it isn't until the clients often have been in the program for a period of time that staff can identify what services can be provided.
But they're entering the program for a purpose, right? I mean, there's some kind of identified agreement.
Well, at time 1, though, at intake, it may not be apparent what all the needs are. So, and actually, to answer that question, that's why we will collect the data. So, I think it'll be helpful to find out what is the perception of the family and what is the perception of this program at time 1. Then we will know is there an agreed plan at time 1 to address what you're saying, and or is it not apparent what all the needs are at time 1? So we'll be able to find that out. And
I don't know. I mean, part of this was sort of taking off from the training yesterday, right? About establishing agreements with clients and the user engagement. I mean, I would think that there would be at least an initial service care plan with agreed upon services.
do you think that service care plan would change over time?
Oh, certainly. I certainly. Okay. You were doing time 1 and time 2.
I hope so. Okay.
So you would capture that time 2, right?
Correct. Okay, last question.
I was just, I had noticed that I believe that the survey administration dates were also so removed from the new version because there's just a intake date and a discharge date now.
Correct.
So is there any expectation or what are the parameters, like, in terms of when staff should be completing this form? Is it they have 30 days after intake to complete it, or 30 days after? I mean, are there any windows of time?
That's an excellent question, because we also want to be cognizant of what the feasibility is in completing these forms. I guess we leave it up to the program's discretion as long as the dates of intake and date of...
No, I think we need to come up with something standard.
Well, okay, so what would be a realistic and feasible standard time frame for completing the forms? For example, the intake form. Is it feasible that your programs can complete it within 30 days of intake? Yes? Okay, there's no disagreement that a 30-day window for completing the intake form? Because, okay, so 30 days. And then for discharge, 30 days? Yes.
Say about intake at 30 days, when you have not yet built a relationship, the information that you're going to learn at 90 days or 120 days makes the family look worse, for lack of a better word, that they have minimized their situation at intake, and the information that you learn later on in the intervention is significantly broader in terms of the trauma and the current situation. And so that's always my concern about those early time ones, is that the family is presenting a more favorable picture than is later determined in the relationship with the family. So.
Okay. At this point, are you going back and editing the intake when you learn that information?
No.
I hope not.
And I don't know that we have a good mechanism to do that with. You know?
Well, just to also respond, I think we wouldn't want anyone to go back and revise time 1 data, because remember, time 1 is a snapshot. So it most certainly may not be the most accurate snapshot, but it's a snapshot of what we know at time 1. But I hear your concerns that it may not be the complete or the most unbiased picture at time 1.
And my concern is that the more accurate information is available at time 2, but it is not a good reflection of the changes in family behavior over time, because the time 1 was not as accurate a picture.
So at one point we talked about data collection every 6 months, which might mitigate that problem, but it is certainly cumbersome.
Is this the extent of what the new packet is going to be, what we have here?
It's not the to answer your question, that is the form that we are planning to use for 2014, 2015. However, it's not the final version.
Right, but these are mostly the questions.
Correct.
So a lot of it isn't behaviorally based. It's really pretty factual. So a lot of it is not going to, other than the questions of, parent having a history of and the needs, those are the only ones that might be minimized. All the other ones are fairly factual. So.
That's true. That's a good point. I think your concerns might be addressed by that the questions that are being asked at the intake or on these forms are purely demographic information, and then there are the risk factors and services questions.
I know, I think she has a valid point that, for example, a biological mother might not disclose something at intake. She may not feel comfortable, she doesn't know this service provider, and until she builds up a rapport, level of trust, it may only be at that point that she reveals, that she's engaged in prostitution or that she used substances while she was pregnant. So there may be some things that you're not going to get at intake because you just don't have that level of rapport. And I'm not sure how you get around that, actually. I think that's just the nature of data collection, is that at any given point in time, you're just going to have some limitations. And we'll just have to be aware of those and be upfront about those, that they do exist. One other thing I wanted to note about the new data collection is, for those of you who are serving families, for example, where you may be serving both the mother and the father, we would like you to collect data on both caregivers. Or if you're serving a mother and a grandmother at the same time, we would like you to report data for all of the caregivers that are involved, not just selecting one, so that we have more complete picture of who's in the lives of the children.
And that was a concern actually on the new family form. The number 6 on page 4 says total number of parents, caregivers who will be served. Who we may be serving at intake, dad may be incarcerated, he may not be identified, grandma may move back to town. So when those change, that won't be a problem, right?
No, correct. So for example, if you were, the mother comes in, does her intake, dad's incarcerated, then he's released and comes back into the family's life. You could do an intake on him when he gets back involved. You don't have to do them all at the same time. So mom's intake could have been in January, dad's intake happens in June. That's exactly right. That's why we're having separate forms for each caregiver.
There was a question here up in the front, or no? Question. Oh, yes.
Do you also want additional information on additional children or just the index child?
So the question is, do we want information on additional children or just on the index child? Right now, it's just information on the index child. Okay, 2 more questions. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, the lady in the middle of the room.
I'm going to go with me.
Yes,
that's good. I know that this is a change in the middle of the reporting cycle. Do you have instructions on what we should do with the old forms and data shelves versus when you want us to start using the new forms?
Okay, yeah, actually that's a good thing that we'll talk about after the break. So please keep that in mind if I don't cover that. A question in the back?
That was my exact thing. I was just wondering because it says the 14-15 fiscal year, and we're only, what, 5 months away from being at the end of this fiscal year? I'm just wondering if it's, how that, if it is really going to be this fiscal year, is it going to be next? So we can.
Okay. Okay, we'll definitely address that. So just moving on with the specific changes. So rephrase items and responses. So for examples of that, we rephrased items such as the child welfare items. So instead of just asking, is it an active case, is it a closed case, we'll ask, was the child the focus of a child abuse neglect investigation? So some items ask more specific information, okay? So why did we make these changes? As you may already are aware of, there were specific issues with that we found room for improvement. This included inconsistent ID assignments, which we already shared with you, how we hope to address that. Inconsistent data, so for the examples of when we had items that were duplicated across forms, like the same questions that were asked for mother and child, but then the data we got were different, so we address that by putting that question just in one form for the child. Missing data, we dropped those items that had a lot of missing data. And then we wanted to only focus on cases that were within the fiscal year. And so instead of having cases that had time to that were not within the fiscal year, we'll not do that moving forward.
I want to just add another example of one of the inconsistencies that we found that we tried to figure out how to deal with this. So you may remember there's a question that asked about had the mother received any type of alcohol or drug treatment prior to starting the program. So we had some cases where someone checked yes, but then checked no to every type of possible treatment option that there was. Conversely, we had examples where they checked no, mother did not receive treatment, but then went ahead and checked, yes, she got outpatient treatment or residential treatment. So just some of those really inconsistencies, and it's just not clear to us, was there a data entry error? Did someone misunderstand the question? So we're trying to resolve some of those inconsistencies in the new forms.
So with these new forms, how can we improve the quality of the fiscal year 2015 data? So we already discussed how we're hoping through the revised data collection form, how we will minimize data inconsistencies. So for example, making sure there's no items that are duplicated throughout the form, to minimize missing data, items that didn't give us a lot of useful information. One of the things that we discussed back in our office is to have an Excel file that had data validation function, meaning we would provide your agencies a data Excel shell where the cells require only certain types of codes. So for example, one of the big examples is, when asking for a child's birth weight, and it's asking in grams, and for one of the questions I asked actually several agencies, is the data on the birth weight correct? Because for some of the cases I had 2 grams, 3 grams. Are these actually pounds?
Yes,
so,
I think we had one baby that weighed 900 pounds.
Oh yeah, a baby that so when we converted the grams, it was 900 pounds. So to help minimize that, so an example of the data validation is that in that specific cell for that specific item of what is a child's birth weight, you can only enter numbers within a certain range. Okay, so that's what I mean about an Excel file that had data validation function. Is that, yes? Yes, and we can certainly do that. And it actually makes more sense in our country where we use pounds more often than grams. Yeah. Yeah, and also, yeah, we can certainly do that. So I'll just double check that we're using pounds instead of grams. Yes, I was on Google a lot for converting birth weight. And also with ages, it asked for months, and so I had to convert an age, and does it really make sense? So let me first ask that, would that be feasible for your agencies to use a data Excel form file? Okay, there's no, it would be fine. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Okay, so there are questions. Yes.
So with this data Excel cell that you would be sending, would it be compatible with other like EHRs and things where data may be held in terms of exporting that data into it? That would be my only concern.
That's a good question. That's one of the things that we were discussing too, because we realized there are at least a few agencies that pull their data from a data system. Not unless we're familiar with what data system you have, I don't have an answer for that. We can discuss this one-to-one.
Yeah, I think what we can do when we go back to Chapin Hall later this week is we can talk to our IT folks, see if they have any thoughts about that. If not, we may need to have a talk with you and your IT staff to see, and it may just not be feasible for some programs, and we understand that. But the idea is to minimize the amount of data cleaning that Jolene has to do. So even if there are 3 or 4 programs that it's just not going to work for, that's fine. That will reduce her workload by 75%. So.
Yes, and that's fine.
In time 2 data collection for the child, it's asking on page 4, not only for the child's age, but for the gender, ethnicity, and race. Would that change from time 1?
This was a question someone else asked me, and so there's one reason for doing that is because the data we get, the children we're getting time 2 data for are not necessarily children that we're getting time 1 data for. So there's often not perfect overlap, and so if we don't ask it, we don't have it. So that's the reason for including it there.
Is there another question? I don't think so. Okay. And are there any other suggestions that you may have of how it can help improve the quality of the data? Yes.
Back to the data validation.
Yes.
For those of us who do have in-house systems already, maybe if you just send us what you're using for your validation scores, we can manually build them into our own systems as well.
Oh, that's a great idea. Okay.
So you don't have to necessarily use the Excel sheet.
Yeah.
All right, so as we were working with the data, we came up with some specific questions that we have for you. And this will also hopefully help us further improve the data collection forms. So there are 5 questions. The first one is the referral source for the parent or caregiver ever different from the referral source for the indexed child? There's one no. Any yeses? The woman in the white. Yes, there are.
Yeah, we have a physician, HIV doc referring mom, but a pediatrician referring child in some cases.
Okay. So it would be helpful to have the referral item in both the child and in the caregiver form for at least a few of the agencies.
I just want to clarify. You're saying that you would have different reasons for the same family, or you're saying that sometimes you get a referral for the child and sometimes it's a referral for the mother?
Yeah, so in our case, the mom would be referred from her infectious disease HIV doc. But the child might be referred from their pediatrician, or there may be a CPS referral to us. It could be from different sources. Either way, I mean, it doesn't either. It might be two different people, but we could capture it somehow.
So we're just trying to find out if we should be asking one question or two. That's what we're trying to figure out. It sounds like we may still need to stay with 2 questions.
Only if you're interested if it's meaningful enough to know who the referral source is for both parties, then yes. But if I don't know that it's meaningful.
And actually, if you look at the different types of agencies.
Or I wonder if it may, I'm just wondering if another way to do it would be to have an option where you could check multiple sources. What do people think? Would it be better to keep it as 2 separate questions? Who referred mom, who referred child? Or would it make more sense to just ask once and you could check, 2 or 3 different possible sources? Which makes more sense?
I just want to suggest that there's room for error if we have 2.
I would keep it at 1. Because even if you ask one question, you're still not going to be able to distinguish. Let's say there's multiple responses or multiple referral sources for a case. How are you going to know which one is for the mom?
I don't know that we're that concerned about whether it's for the mom or the child. We just want to get a sense of who's referring these families. I don't think it matters all that much whether it was the mom that was referred, the child. So it sounds like maybe asking it just once, but allowing for the possibility that there are multiple referral sources.
All right, so our next question to you is the discharge exit date for the parent or caregiver ever different from the discharge exit date for the index child? I have a yes and I have a no.
You said yes.
I said
Can
yes.
you give an example of when that might happen?
We're working on permanency for the child, and that's been established. But we still want to stay involved with the family because of stability reasons, and it's then the parent who's going to need more supports around. Let's say, I'll give an example of a grandparent who takes on a child who was orphaned by HIV, and we've achieved the guardianship for that grandmother, but she is having difficulty dealing with the HIV and childbearing and all the responsibilities. So we'll stay supporting that family after that piece is done for the child.
So you would actually discharge the child even though you're still serving the family?
I don't think we actually discharge. I think we make the parent the client. But your question is the discharge or exit date. The child, we've achieved a goal for the child, but we still have other goals for the rest of the family.
Okay,
so,
great.
yeah.
Yes. We had one example where our mom was murdered. Bio mom was murdered. Kids stayed in care in our program. They actually transitioned to foster care. So we kept providing mental health services until there was a dispo.
Okay, so there's another example of the dates being different. Okay.
We had a couple, and one parent chooses to leave the program, but the other, since we're doing on both, and if one parent stays and child stays with that parent.
Okay, that's actually really a great example of when there are different dates, as if you're serving multiple caregivers. So it sounds like we will keep it separate, or we will have the item for the different individuals served. Yes, still serving the child. Okay, third question, is it informative to collect data on risk factors for givers who are not biological parents? I'm sorry, yes?
I would just say that those 2 questions are related to each other, in that if we're going to start collecting significant information on multiple caregivers, yes, it would be informative, and yes, it would be helpful to have multiple different times, but we are talking about significantly additional data collection that will be cumbersome. Yes, and consent issues around all those multiple caregivers.
But some programs are set up that way.
They never consented to the program.
Okay, so I hear that for those that consent, then that's who you collect data on. So although you may be serving multiple caregivers, but not all the caregivers are consenting, then you only collect data on those who are consenting. Okay? That's very important.
I think we really have to collect it on multiple caregivers. Some programs are serving, married couples or couples that live together, and it's really impossible to pick one. I mean, why would you choose mother versus father? I think it doesn't make sense if the program is serving both parents. You'd want data on both.
And hopefully the forms, these items, are already information that you're collecting. So, yes.
We are very clear that mom is the gatekeeper, that the family is our client, but the family is who mom defines as the family. And if she does not define dad as family, or she does not define grandma's family, or she does, then we are going to respond accordingly. So we may or may not have consent on people who are providing significant caregiving.
Okay, understood. What does not applicable mean as a response to questions about completing alcohol and other drug abuse treatment in the case of parents who receive treatment? So just to remind you, there is a question about whether a caregiver received treatment, and then there was a not applicable response option. Could you shed light to us of what the not applicable means? Yes.
I didn't fill it out this way, but my only guess is that because you put in self-help, which is AANA, which is not actually treatment, but that's an option, there's no real completion of that. So if that's their only thing that they're doing, it would be not applicable to say whether they've completed or not.
Why do we put AA as treatment and NA as treatment? It's not treatment. I was just wondering why we list NA and AA as treatment.
That was
That's how the form has been set up. Do people think we should remove that? Is that not useful information?
It was listed, so NA and A was listed as examples of self-help treatment. Is that? It's not treatment? Okay.
It's supportive.
It's supportive.
Okay.
Okay.
But it's not
Supportive
So it's a good item to capture.
Yes.
To know that
Okay,
you're
maybe
engaged
under
in it.
services.
It's just
Under
not
services, not treatment.
Okay, so NAAA, these are support treatments that we can include in the list of services provided, but for self-help, it's not an example of self-help treatment, correct?
It's not treatment.
Oh, it's not a treatment, or self-help, okay. Okay.
What if the client defines it as treatment?
Yeah. It's not treatment.
Then the client needs to learn that it's not treatment. If the client defines
People have
and they have considered it part of treatment.
They're not filling the form out.
All right, so once again, yeah, these forms are being, as of now, being completed by program staff. So based on program staff, we will know that NA and AA are support services. It's not treatment. All right, ready for the last question? Okay. What are common reasons services would be terminated for non-compliance? We'll start from the front. Yes.
They stopped showing up to treatment.
Can you repeat?
Yeah.
Sure. One answer was they just stopped showing up. I'll repeat the answers. Or okay, so they stop showing up or don't show up. What are other reasons that for termination for non-compliance? There were several other hands. Yes. In the back.
We're residential, and if they engage in a physical altercation, they'll be terminated from our program, and we'll provide referral services. As is, if they bring substances and use on site, that's another issue where we would terminate and provide referrals.
Okay, so another reason is in residential, the individual engaged in altercation and used substances, brought substances onto the premises. Oh, used on site. Use substances on site. Okay.
So like that kind of speaks to just not following basic safety rules.
Okay, other reasons for non-termination due to non-compliance? This is just going to give us better ideas too for gathering termination data. Ricky?
Can I just ask a question, please, of the individual who just mentioned stop showing up? Can we distinguish between people who stop showing up and people the program cannot locate or contact?
Okay, so Ricky was asking a follow-up question just to clarify regarding the answer or the reason for termination due to noncompliance being the person not showing up. Could we further clarify that being as, I'm sorry, repeat it one more time?
Can we distinguish between people who fail to show up and people that the program staff cannot locate?
Okay. Would we be able to distinguish those that did not show up and those that the program could not locate?
Well, I think outreach is, we provide outreach, and so we do outreach, and if we cannot locate the client and they don't respond to a letter of discharge that's sent out within 10 days, I try to hold on to them for as long as I can, which is usually a month, and after that they're being discharged for non-compliance.
Okay, so the response is that the program has the procedure to do outreach. So they do try to locate. And then after a certain amount of time, if they're unable to locate, then they're identified as stop showing up.
So can I ask a question? In that case, would you have checked off discharged for noncompliance or discharged unable to locate?
That's a good question. I didn't fill out the forms. I will be now, but I'd have to ask you.
Yes, go ahead.
I do discharge for unable to locate.
HIV.
Not for non-compliance.
They might not.
Okay, so for one agency, they check off unable to locate.
But would you have an intake on that person?
Yeah.
No.
Not on the wait list?
Yeah.
No, but for people that have done intakes, that we've done intakes for, we call it non-compliance. I always discharge people for non-compliance if they don't show up for treatment. Like having someone show up for 6 weeks and then all of a sudden they stop showing up. I reach out, I send them a letter, they still don't respond. Plus peers have called them because part of the program is peer support.
So a lot of programs do an intake.
Mm-hmm.
And then they may do a more in-depth evaluation assessment to determine the exact mix of services, and they actually start services at the next time or 2 times later. So those people may never engage in the service at all after the intake. And how would that be captured?
Non-compliance. That's what I would think. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, so one idea is that a definition for non-compliance are those that have completed intake as well as completed some sort of evaluation.
So one of the questions that we've added to the time 2 form is how many weeks did the program serve this mother or child? So that might capture the point you're making about families that did an intake, but then you never saw them again. You could actually say 0.
But if they're involved in active outreach and engagement, their staff may be working, say, for a month, trying to get them to come in and engage, but they never actually deliver face-to-face services. So the discharge date could be 30 days later.
Right.
But, so if you say you're capturing services, what do you mean by that?
The number of weeks.
So you're saying, would they count that time that they're spending tracking down the family? Is that what you're asking? I don't know that I would count that as providing services if they're not seeing the client.
They could have a 30-day length of stay between the intake and the exit. Mm-hmm. How are you measuring services they received in that month?
But you're saying they didn't receive any.
They may never receive any.
So wouldn't that be 0 length of time served?
So I guess The question is, how are you actually counting the services?
But we actually have there's a question that asks that. How many, I don't know if it's weeks or months, I can't remember. How many weeks did you serve this family? In that case, I would have said 0. We did an intake, but we didn't provide them any services.
So I would have trouble with dosage on that, because you could see them once a month or, once every 2 weeks or something. Or you could be seeing them daily in that time period. So you're not capturing dosage.
Exactly.
Dosage is going to be hard to capture.
I agree. I mean, I think we just have to think about what's reasonable to expect the programs to report too. I mean, I don't know that we can ask people to report on the dosage for every type of service they provide. I don't know that that's going to be feasible.
We have about 1 minute left.
I just want to suggest that you not talk right into the microphone.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Okay, the woman in orange.
I just wanted to get the clarification on the outreach then. So if we enroll a family and we serve them for 3 or 4 months and then we can't find mom, we're going to look for her for quite a while. So if we're calling grandma and we're calling children's division and we're sending letters, we're not counting that as services. We're counting services as our last contact. Is that how you want it done?
Define.
I mean, I don't know. I guess it's more of a question for the group that we can reach some consistency. I don't want to decide for everyone. I want people to come to some consensus here.
Yes.
I think it's a service based on our work. I mean, if we were putting in for another form of how much time we're putting into that client, but I don't think it's a service for the client because we are not actually speaking to them. Even if we are actively searching for them, they are not receiving a direct service from the
So
work.
maybe we need to clarify direct service. How many weeks of direct service was provided? Okay, so direct service. I think there's one last question, and then I think we'll cap it. Is that okay? Because there's a woman in black, right? Okay, yes.
Yeah, I think it might be the case that other programs are like this in that we're providing specific AIA-funded services with a consent to women who are already in another treatment setting. And so there can be 2 reasons why they are at time 2 or discharged. One is because they stopped coming to our services, but they're still successfully in the treatment facility. And the other one is because the treatment facility has lost contact with them. And I think, from what I know of other programs, sometimes they're similar. So I'm wondering how to talk about time 2 for those women who are no longer directly receiving AIA-funded services, and I've lost them in terms of my consent to collect data on them, but they're still there. They haven't actually, they didn't terminate. They're still at the treatment facility.
Okay, so they're still at the treatment facility, but they are not receiving AIA-funded services.
Then they've terminated from the
Okay, so then they have terminated from the AIA program. So I guess we also have to make sure that we clarify for reasons for termination is that they are now no longer receiving AIA-funded services, but still receiving services from a program. Okay.
So we want to spend the rest of the time we have together answering any more questions you have, hearing any more suggestions or concerns you have. We talked a little bit about one of the questions that was raised before the break was when to start using the revised data collection forms. I'm kind of getting the feeling, given that we still have some wrinkles to work out, that it may make sense to hold off until 2016. So what we'll have you do is finish this year through the end of September using the form that you've been using in the past. And then when we start up again new September 30, 2015, we'll have the new form, the final version of the new form. You can start using it then. So does that sound workable to people? So you'll continue using the old form for the next few months, wrap up this year's work, and then starting with the new fiscal year, that's when we'll switch over. We'll have the forms finalized by then, incorporating all of your feedback. Does that make sense to folks? Questions? Yes.
And you would use the new form time 2 for even those who did the old form?
I think so. Yeah, I think even though that you may have used the old Time 1 form, I think we want to just do a clean break. I think it will just get really confusing if some people are submitting data with the old form and some with the new form. So we'll just do a clean break at the end of September. Yeah.
For those of us who have to go through IRB processes, I would hope you'd have all those changes and protocols in place at least a couple of months ahead.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to try to do. That's what we'll spend part of the next couple of months doing. How long do most of you need to get something through your IRBs? I mean, I know what I have to go through with my IRB, but I don't know that that's necessarily reflective of other IRBs. So what do people think is a reasonable deadline that you need to have that final form?
3 months. 3 months. 3 months. At least 3 months. I have 3 IRBs.
Oh, wow. Yeah, 3 months is good, because by the time you can begin, make changes, we'll be putting in December, so we would need it.
So, let's see, June, July. So you would need them by June 1st? Okay. Okay. So that gives us a month or so to address some of the things that we've talked about today. Yes.
On the old form that we're going to continue to use, do we have to ask all of the questions still, or the ones that we know you've taken out and we just skip over those?
I think the best thing to do is just to use the form as it is. So even if there are things that we're eventually going to remove, I think just to avoid confusion where someone thought that they should leave something out, we'll just say use the form as you have been using it, and then when we do, we'll just do the clean break at the end of September. Other questions about the sort of how we're going to do the switch over? Yeah.
I also just wanted to ask if you can send out the revised, before you finalize, send out drafts for feedback and the questions and all, because so you have a more systematic opportunity for people to think about it.
Yeah, what we would like you to do actually is after the meeting today, if you could spend some time going through the draft of the revised form. If there are changes you think to wording or questions that we should have added or response options that are missing or whatever seems changes you think need to be made to this draft, please provide us with that feedback, and then we can incorporate that into the final version. Yes.
And are you planning the addendum that is the sort of information about how to answer each question? We have had that in the past sometimes. Are we going to get something similar this time?
So can you say a little bit more about what you mean?
Well, like I was just thinking about the weeks of time in service. You know, we were saying, are we going to count from initial contact when, you know, it may take us 3 or 4 or 5 weeks to get somebody enrolled? Are we going to use the enrollment date? Are we going to use the discharge date or the last date of contact? You know, just defining some of those things that we talked about and others that may present themselves.
So to provide some clarification on how to answer certain questions.
A little handbook that goes with form completion.
Other questions? So are there things that are not being captured in these data collection forms that you think should be captured? Yes.
How well do you define, are you able to describe the different programs that are grantees here? Because it seems there's a broad variety of programs. It's not just HIV and substance abuse. There are other distinguishing characteristics of the program.
So that's a great segue. So one of the other tasks that we have for the rest of this year is to actually create another form, and this would be collecting program level data. So you've been providing us is client level data, individual participant level data. What we're hoping to do in the next couple of months is to come up with a form that captures program level data to get at various dimensions of the different programs in terms of staffing, training, range of services provided, who you get referrals from, who you refer clients out to, those kind of program level measures. So I think that will give us a better picture of what the sort of range of programs looks like. Again, we'd like to get your input about various dimensions we should be trying to find out about. Can you think of, are there certain dimensions that would be of interest to you?
Well, I mean, you're capturing services, and I'm thinking, for instance, we aren't a treatment program at all. And then there's summer residential programs with, 10 months of services on average. Others maybe 3-month programs, that sort of thing. The intensity of, the mix of services that are offered through the program. Lots of people do referrals, and often, who knows, what people actually receive in the end. Relationships with child welfare certainly seems like a key one, because such a large proportion of this population is child welfare involved. There are a variety of things.
Yeah, I think those are some of the very dimensions that we're thinking about trying to capture. Do other people have thoughts about that?
It'd also be helpful to know which evidence-based practices are being implemented across the various sites, and that may help you also think about which standardized tools you use as well. If 6 sites are using, Seeking Safety, then, that might provide sufficient data in one particular domain, so I think that would be helpful.
Other thoughts? Other things you'd like to know about one another's programs, their dimensions or their features?
Forgive me, it's just a really basic question, but it's really piggybacking on the question that you just asked around our programs are so diverse. What can you hope to do with this data?
Well, so one of the ideas, right, no, that's a great question. No, one of the ideas is to try to, like you said, that there's the range of programs is quite diverse, but there may be enough commonalities among a subset of programs. So you could imagine there may be, say, 6 or 7 programs that have a number of dimensions in common that, even though they're not identical programs, you could kind of group them into a cluster. And then you could do some analyses of programs within that cluster, or compare that cluster of programs to another cluster of programs that there's a lot of homogeneity within the cluster, but heterogeneity across the clusters.
So that's the work that you would be doing?
Exactly. That's what.
Where would that go? Would that come back to us? Is that going up to us?
Yeah. So I could imagine, for example, in a future report where we would look at, we would do analyses by cluster type, right? So rather than what you have right now, these descriptive statistics are just sort of across all programs regardless of type, where we would actually do breakdowns by, this cluster of 6 programs versus that cluster of programs. So you get a sense of how different, the types of clients that different programs serve, the types of services that they provide, to get a little more nuanced view.
I'm a local evaluator, and so my priority has been on evaluating my local program. And it seems like now we're really being called on to divert our energy just as much to looking at the cross-site as we are to evaluating our program. So I'm just trying to understand priorities. Like, it's changing which data we collect. Right. It's changing my IRB.
Jan, do you want to address that? That sounds like a federal public officer question. I'm not going to get my hands on
that. I would just say that I feel your pain. I understand. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be glib. I understand that it feels like a tension, but both pieces of information are necessary.
Okay. That's just right.
And yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your effort.
I guess what we'd like to do is to make it so that you're not collecting a lot of data unnecessarily, so that the data that we're collecting for the cross-site has some correspondence to what you're collecting as a local evaluator, so that you're not doing double work.
But we already had definitions in place, so now we're looking at different.
Right.
it's different. It's going to be different.
Right. I don't know that there's a way around it.
Okay.
Other questions people have? Have people had a chance to look at any of the revisions and people have thoughts about it? Yeah.
I'm looking at, like for instance, I have a client right now that's in our day treatment program, and she just completed residential treatment because part of the residential component is that she does 4 months in residential treatment and then she attends aftercare for 8 months, and then she graduates that program. So she will be completing a residential program while she's in our day treatment program. And so is that something that, would that be a yes in this section, this discharge section?
So when she's in the day treatment, is she still getting AIA funded services, or is that not part of the AIA program? Is that a totally separate?
Oh, so if that program's not funded by AIA.
Right, then you would say she got
I
discharged
get it.
from the
I'm sorry.
AIA program.
Okay. Okay, I get it. I'm sorry.
But no,
That's
that's a
actually a good question.
Yeah.
Not so much on this, but as far as definitions, are we going to have like a definitional manual that we can, reference to make sure we're being consistent as a group?
I think whoever asked the question earlier, I think that was a suggestion that was made, that we provide some kind of,
So just like how you had a code book, we'll have something similar to that, but hopefully it'll be simpler and easier to use. Okay. We won't have so many footnotes in it, but just simple, direct explanations.
And you should always feel free to contact us if you're filling out the form and you're not sure which response to give. We might be able to provide some guidance, or that's probably the best way to proceed if you're uncertain about what to do. Other people have any feedback about what you've seen so far in the revised forms? Again, feel free to send us any comments or suggestions you have.
Sure.
I think we tired them out this morning. They were all so lively. They all look exhausted. A lot of it is the same. We didn't do a massive overhaul of the forms. A lot of it's really nuanced changes. I think we talked about most of the major changes.
Well, you have our email address because either you got an email from myself or from Amy, so please do feel free to email us with any other suggestions or comments, because we definitely want to get this data collection form ready for you in time.
One of the questions that we sort of had was a lot of questions are not applicable to certain clients, and how to deal with those questions. So there's sort of, the way I see it, there's kind of two ways to do that. One is to have skip patterns scattered throughout the document. So if you answered yes to question 5, you go to question 6. Otherwise, you skip down to question 10, right? The other option is just to have not applicable as a response option to the questions that are not applicable. Right now, the form is set up with the latter, so there's a lot you can check not applicable for pretty much every question. If people would prefer, we could do skip patterns. I don't know that there's a better or worse way to do it. Just trying to think through what makes more sense for people as they're filling out the form.
I would rather have a skip, but not everybody.
I think she's going to disagree.
Yeah, no, we have other assessments that have skip patterns, and those get very confusing.
Yeah, a lot of the data cleaning were on items that had skip patterns. So my personal preference is just have not applicable, especially with the way that we're collecting the data. It's paper pencil form paper pen basically. If we had an online data system, that would help tremendously with any skip pattern items. But I mean, of course, we're completely open ears what is most convenient and helpful for you. I mean, someone said they prefer skip patterns. Anyone else prefer skip patterns?
Yes. Because we're doing
local evaluations. And we're, as you described yourself, people are using all different sorts of indexes or other instruments, or they've integrated into their existing intake systems in which a lot of this information is already captured, so rather than creating burden on staff and clients in this case, I'm sure we all have different configurations of how we capture this cross-site data, so I think it makes it very difficult to standardize it.
It does, but that's where some of the problems that we ran into have come from, is that there just hasn't been any standardization, and that different programs are doing things very differently. Other thoughts? Questions? Anything else? They all want to go to lunch.
It's too early.
How many of you are local evaluators? How many of you are local evaluators? And where are you in terms of your evaluation at this point? Are you, I don't know the timeline. How, where are you in the process?
What do you mean, where are we in the process?
What year?
Yeah. Where are you in the?
I'm probably one of those two that wasn't showing up in fiscal year 14, but we may have had a few cases. But with 3 IRBs to go through, it took us a long time. I'm up to continuation on one of them now, so. But we should all be in different places.
What I'm just trying to figure out is when we'll begin to see results from these local evaluations.
Yes.
I think
We've started data collection about 6 months ago with a comparison site, and so they've enrolled about 20 clients, and so we're starting to collect data. We haven't analyzed that data, however, we're waiting until the sample gets a little bigger. But there are lots of limitations that we've encountered and challenges, so.
And how long do you plan to collect data for?
Probably midway through year 4, I would imagine, so another year. And then we'll save the last 6 months or so for analysis. So our sample will probably be quite small. But we'll have important lessons to share.
Yep.
And for the local evaluators, are you all aware of James Bell's availability for support and technical assistance? Is anybody not aware of James Bell's support? Okay, so we'll be sending, the Research Center will send information out. James Bell provides training and technical assistance to the local evaluators, program by program. If there are any struggles that you're having, not specific to the cross-site, they can help out. They've helped programs figure out how to do, to step up the rigor, if they're having trouble because they've implemented randomized control and they're not getting referrals anymore, things like that. They really help troubleshoot. So I'll send out the contact info for James Bell after this.
I think we've run out of questions, Amanda.
Okay, did you want to go through the forms? Have folks had a chance to look at the forms in there and to really take a look at the language, or are you comfortable with that? Yeah? Yes, you're comfortable. You don't need further. You're all worn out.